Today's guest has culled 42 of the best posts from his widely read blog and turned them into a deceptively light, sneakily serious compendium of sometimes heretical reflections on management. The moral is managers need to leave their castles and find out what's exactly going on in their kingdoms. And like real bedtime stories, his essays have metaphors galore. We'll discover the Maestro myth of managing, find the soft underbelly of hard data. He writes, for example, just try not to be outraged by anything you read, because some of my most outrageous ideas turn out to be my best. They just take a while to become obvious. This episode is to bring management down from the clouds by debunking the Maestro myth of management, replacing keynote speakers with keynote listening, uncovering the soft underbelly of hard data, and questioning the label CEO on hospitals, governments, and other endangered species. Who better to write bedtime stories for managers than the purveyor of outrageous ideas that eventually become obvious? This is his 20th book, certainly his most playful and probably his most serious. It's a great pleasure to welcome back the man with 20 honorary degrees to share his insights from his 20th book, Bedtime Stories for Managers. Henry Mintzberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. That's a nice introduction. Okay, I'll try and live up to it for a while.
It was easy to remember because it was your 20th book and you have 20 honorary degrees. So the 20s kind of nicely aligned for me, man. It was easier for my memory that way.
And now it's 21 and 21.
Have you got 21 now?
Yeah, then my book on structure and another degree, yeah, in Peru. Yeah.
I'm out of date, man. I can't keep up with you at the moment. You were going to call this book, I thought we'd start this way. You were going to call this book Eating Scrambled Eggs. And indeed, you dedicate the book to managers who do eat scrambled eggs so that their organizations can work like a cow. Maybe we should open by explaining what you meant there.
Yeah, I was going to call it Managing Scrambled Eggs because the first story is about an airline chief executive whose company was the biggest in the world and was about to go bankrupt. And I flew on it one morning from Montreal to New York, and they served these things they called scrambled eggs. And I said to the flight attendant, I've eaten bad stuff on airplanes, but nothing comes close to this. And she said, I know we keep telling them they won't listen. Now, how could they not listen? If you're running a cemetery, maybe you don't speak to your customers, but an airline? Anyway, I told that story to some managers, and one of them from IBM came up to me and said that this guy was late for a plane one day, and so they bumped a first-class passenger or business class passenger so he could sit where he was accustomed. And during the flight, he went to the back. I guess he had to ask where economy class was, but he discovered it and apologized to the customer, who turned out to be the president of IBM. Now, the moral of the story is not that you shouldn't bump the president of IBM. The moral of the story is that you should get on the ground or in the back and see what's going on in your organization and live it instead of avoiding it. He should be sitting in economy class as often as his customers are sitting in economy class.
You have so many brilliant quotes throughout the book, and one of them was from the founder of Panasonic and Konosuke Matsushita. And he said, big things and little things are my job. Middle level arrangements can be delegated. Maybe you'll extract what you meant by placing that in the book as well.
Well, the big things are the big picture, but you don't paint the big picture with great big brush strokes. You paint the big picture with little brush strokes that you learn by doing. And as you add brush strokes, you learn and the picture evolves. So this image of kind of, grand strategies, sitting in board meetings, create grand strategies is a myth. Usually it's learned. I mean, even if I don't know how Musk developed his strategy about cars. His strategy didn't come immaculately conceived. He had to work it out.
Absolutely learned from experience, which is core to what you talk about the book. For example, in your other book, that you want managers, not MBAs. You talk about the key about getting out there and actually learning by doing.
Yeah, everything in the world is pat. Everything in the world is fixed and given and programmed and determined, including strategy. I remember a consulting firm once saying, we need 3 days to give a company a strategy. That's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard about strategy. You need years to learn a strategy. And and so things are pat, and uh, I don't like puzzles, jigsaw puzzles, because jigsaw puzzles are not puzzles. Puzzles are things that are mysterious and difficult. A jigsaw puzzle is intricate, but it's not difficult to conceive. You just have to be patient and figure out all the pieces. That's not the way things work in business or much else in life today. Puzzling puzzles, you just got to try everything you can, learn, continue with what works, get rid of what doesn't, and work your way to success. I mean, that's the way things work. And this kind of, sort of analytical obsession is doing a great harm to many organizations.
Some studies you mentioned in the book, for example, gobbling up value, you looked at all these studies where MBAs, and you're not damning of MBAs, but there's some questionable outcomes from some of the studies that were done in MBAs. You mentioned, for example, Danny Miller, and how these MBAs, when they led companies, they often looked great in the short term, but soon after they left or were forced to leave, the company started to fail pretty dramatically. I'd love you to share that. And this is towards the end of the book, the latter half of the book, but I'd love to bring it right to the top because this short term focus often comes from the case method, for example, in college, or how people are taught in school, that it's not the same as the real world.
Yeah, I am damning of MBAs as a way to develop managers. I have no objection to MBA programs that develop financial analysts and marketing researchers and that kind of thing. They're good at that. But the analytical bent of the MBA program is antithetical to management, which is a practice. And it's a practice where I do it as a triangle where art, science, craft, and science meet, and much more craft than anything else. That's the learning. And some art, which is the creative side, and not that much science compared to professions, real professions, like medicine or engineering, where they use a lot of science. Not much science in management. So we did an initial study way back. There was a book out of the Harvard Business School that glorified the school, and early on had a list of Harvard's sort of most illustrious graduates. This was 1990, and there were 19 people on that list. And I looked at this well after 1990, and I kind of said, "Hey, wait a minute, what's he doing there?" I think they were all he. What's he doing there? So people whose company went bankrupt, who were kicked out by the board. There were all kinds of kind of aberrations on that list, that looked so good in 1990. So we did a very careful study of all 19. 10 of them were total failures. I think it was 4 of them who were questionable, and 5 of them looked like they were doing fine. So that's not much of a record. Then Danny did a follow-up study some years later. He took the chief executives of every company that appeared on the front page, on the cover of Forbes and Business Week and Fortune. Every chief executive who appeared on the cover, and he tracked the record of those companies. First of all, they all went down. This was kind of the kiss of death in a way. But those managed by MBAs went down further, and their chief executives were paid more. So, for a worse record, they were well paid and even better paid than people who didn't do quite as bad as they did. So it's a myth. The trouble, you don't create a manager in a classroom any more than you create a swimmer in a classroom. You have to get in the water. And once you're in the water, you swim around, you flounder around, and then you can learn about swimming. And once you get your bearings, you can learn the backstroke or whatever it is. And same thing with management. Once you know management, you can come into a classroom like our International Master's Program for Managers, impm.org, where they come in with experience and they spend half the time listening to us, but the other half learning from each other. If I talk about strategy and some different ways of thinking about strategy, then they sit at round tables and they go into their conversations and they talk about what they do in their company and how they might be able to use emergent strategy and not just deliberate plan strategy.
And of course, Henry, for those who don't know, if you don't know this, Henry is the father of emergent strategy. He's the man who put that on the map, which is really the only strategy, emergent. You only can learn by doing. The context never is the same. The configuration of companies are never the same. So you can't just cookie cutter strategy from one place and put it to the next. Henry, I thought maybe you'd share a quick rendition of emergent strategy because you mentioned it there. We didn't mention it in the last episode, and I think we'd people would be angry with me for not asking you, the maestro of emergent strategy, to share it.
Well, strategies form rather than be formulated, or at least I should say it's a combination of the two. I have a routine whenever I teach managers. I say, okay, how do you define strategy? And the words come out: plan, future, vision. And I say, okay, all your definitions are from here forward. And that's consistent with the dictionary, define strategy that way. Now, put that aside for a second. Tell me what strategy your company actually pursued over the last 5 years. Would you do that? And they say, sure. And I say, well, yeah, how can you do it? It doesn't jive with the definition of strategy. Strategy is not about what you did. Strategy is about what you're going to do, not what you did. But let's go back 5 years and you tell me if the strategy you intended 5 years ago was actually the strategy you pursued over these 5 years. And I give them a choice, more or less yes, more or less no, or somewhere in between. And it's always the same result. More or less yes, we get very few, some. In other words, that's deliberate plan strategy. We get very few of that. More or less no, we get a few more of those. But mostly we get in between. In other words, strategy is a combination of learning as you go along and incorporating that. And once you know it works and you stabilize it, then that's your new deliberate strategy, or at least your emerged deliberate strategy. And then strategic planning becomes not creating strategy, but manifesting the consequences of the strategy you have, which is why it so often reduces to a numbers game. We've got to hire so many people and build so many factories and introduce so many products and so on and so forth. Strategic planning is actually strategic programming.
Fantastic. And I used the term maestro specifically. I was planting seeds that you talk about in the previous book that we covered as well, Rebalancing Society, because you share another game with your students, which is the manager as maestro game. And I thought I'd tee you up here with the picture. So the quote from the book is, picture the managerial maestro on the podium. A flick of the baton and marketing opens, a wave of the wand and sales chime in, and a grand sweep of the arms, and HR, PR, and IT harmonize. It's a manager's dream. You can even attend leadership workshops orchestrated by conductors. And then you go on to share 3 quotes about this metaphor. And as you read them, you ask all students to share a little game. You say, please vote for which quote best captures your understanding of managing.
One comes from Drucker that says the manager is both composer and conductor. Wow, even better than conductor. He's the composer, or she is the composer too. The second quote is from Sune Carlson, a Swedish economist who actually studied managers, chief executives, and he concluded that they're not conductors, they're puppets, with everybody pulling the strings. And then I quote Len Sales, who did a great study of middle managers, and Sales said, yeah, it's like conducting all right when people are moving the music stands and people are making unreasonable requests and the musicians are getting antsy and the donor wants a change in the program. He says that's the conductor role. So the performance is a myth in a way. I watched some opera last night on television, and it's such an act. The physicians don't even look at the guy. It's just an act. It's rehearsals where people manage, because then they kind of stop things and let's do this and try that and so on and so forth. But performance is an awful metaphor for managing.
When you do that game, which quote do people tend to land on when you share that game with groups?
Totally the third one. Totally the third one. Well, they know something suspicious, because I start off by saying I'm going to read you 3 quotes, and you get to vote for the one that you think is most accurate, but you have to vote after each one. So after I read the first one, you have to decide whether you're going to vote, even though I haven't read the other 2. I said, but to counter that, you're allowed to vote 3 times. But they don't. At this point, they're suspicious. They don't vote for the first. They don't. Some vote for the second, and everybody votes for the third.
You share beautiful quotes throughout the book, and you knew many of these people that I would love to have met and love to interview. One of them is the late Jim March of Stanford Business School. And one of the great quotes he has is, leadership involves plumbing as well as poetry. And you go on to say here, the fable that leadership is separate from and superior to management has been bad for management and even worse for leadership. I'd love you to expand on that.
It's just narcissism. This idea that I'm a leader. I remember we started one of our MBA programs, which are with seasoned managers, and it was the first morning, and one of the marketing guys came in and said, "Who's a leader? Who's a leader?" With this all hyped up bullshit, pardon me. And a few hands went up, and I thought, those people are not leaders. You don't designate yourself as a leader. Other people designate you. But leadership and management are 2 sides of the same coin. Nobody wants a manager who doesn't lead. And nobody wants a leader who doesn't manage, because they don't know what's going on. So it's 2 sides of the same coin. Leadership, to me, is the interpersonal side of managing. And we need managers who lead, and we need leaders who manage. I think it's done enormous harm.
There's a guy you mentioned, CEO of Royal Bank of Canada, John Cleghorn, and he developed a reputation in his company for calling the office on his way to the airport to report broken ATM machines. And you ask the question, you go, well, was he micromanaging? Because most people would say yes.
But not at all. He was being a model. He was exemplifying what everybody in the company should do, not just him. Anybody who sees a broken ATM machine should report it as soon as possible. And that's what he was saying. And he was revered for that. He got rid of the company's cars, the limousines for the executives. And he drove a Subaru himself. This is the biggest bank in Canada. He's a modest guy. I sit in his chair. I used to have his name on the back of my chair, so I sit in the Cleghorn chair. But what I like, and McGill knew it when they did it, is he didn't donate that chair. He chaired the campaign, and they took leftover money in the campaign, and in honor of his contribution, created a chair in his name and invited me to sit in it.
I heard once through the back channels that some companies even have a separate lift for C-suite executives, so they don't have to mix with the common folk inside the company. And one of the things from reading and studying your work that I really have made implicit the knowledge is that you have to mix with people. You have to get out on the street. You have to get outside the building, as Steve Blank would say. And you say, we may have heard of being overmanaged and underled, but now it's the opposite. We have too much lofty leadership and not enough engaging with both your own people and with your customers.
BT has a famous headquarters building in London. I don't know if they still occupy it, but there is an elevator on the ground floor that only goes to the top floor. And only the chief executive, or I guess whoever works around, goes on that. What a perfect way to make sure you never bump into anybody.
It's incredible. And in the book, you talk about the flawed manager, and you compiled a list of 52 qualities necessary to be a great manager, which means very few will have all 52, and therefore will inevitably have flawed managers. And as you say, we often end up with kiss up and kick down people as a result of this.
This is probably my favorite part of the book. You have to pick managers for their flaws as much as for their strengths, because the flaws are what might do them in. So you got to know about the flaws. But how do you know about the flaws when managers and chief executives are almost always chosen by their superiors? The CEO is chosen by the board. Other managers are chosen by committees of more senior managers. And these are the last people who know how they manage. Now, how do you know someone's flaws? There's only two ways, I think. One is you marry them or live with them, and the other is you work for them. Now, you work as them as your managers. Now, you can't ask a spouse about someone's flaws because they'll be biased, and you certainly can't ask an ex-spouse because they're even more biased. But you can ask the people who experience their management. So no candidate should ever be selected without getting the views of the people who they managed. And I think, and I never say this about anything else, I think that one thing could change the practice of managing monumentally.
The next thing you talk about, and this is really at the soul of this show, Henry, is the fact that we're losing soul in businesses, and in an age where we're automating the efficiency, bringing AI into businesses more and more, everything's measured. And there's a great quote by Oscar Wilde: "A fool is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." But when we overmeasure things, we actually strip away oftentimes the things that are so valuable that can't be measured, and they're invisible in many ways, but they're actually the spirit or the soul of a business. And I thought this was such an important thing to share. And if you talk about that at a conference or a summit, people would actually throw their eyes up to heaven and kind of go, "Oh, here we go. Somebody's been drinking the Kool-Aid again." But it's so important in business. It's actually the differentiator in many ways.
Well, Aidan, you and I well know that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, right? This is probably the stupidest thing that's ever been said, because many of the most interesting things just don't lend themselves to measurement. Who measures culture? Who measures the performance of managers, other than short-term stock increase? Who ever even tried to measure the effects of measurement other than assuming it's the holy grail? Now, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, then we have to get rid of both measurement and management themselves, because we can't measure either very well. So this is the kind of nonsense that gets paraded around, and it's just silly. I kind of wonder, doesn't anybody stop and think a little bit? You can't measure it, you can't manage it, awful.
I absolutely loved the anecdote you told about the orchestra and the MBA who had to choose something to measure, and he measured then, as a result, the orchestra. I'd love you to share this one with our audience. This is a brilliant bedtime story.
Well, there's an old story that came out of the British Treasury, I think, in the 40s. I had an MBA student. They didn't say it at that point. I say it's a young MBA student who was sent out to study an organization about which he had no knowledge and come back and report on how to make it more effective. So he chose a symphony orchestra. And he comes back and says things like, well, for considerable periods, the oboe players had nothing to do. So, why can't you make use of them in some other way? And the lead violinist's instrument was hundreds of years old. And if they used proper depreciation schedules, they could have thrown it in the garbage and got him a brand new violin. It kind of goes on. So much effort was wasted in the playing of semi-quavers, whereas if they upped it to semi-quavers, they could hire low-grade operatives and wouldn't have to pay the musicians so much. I mean, it's quite hilarious. But of course, if the same thing was written about a factory, nobody would be laughing. They'd be crying, because the same thing is always written about factories, even healthcare performance, even physicians. But when you do it into the symphony orchestra, it reveals the fallacy, utter fallacy of it.
I skipped ahead with the MBA stories and the studies that you told about Danny Miller and your own studies. In that sometimes you have almost executive boredom where they'll come into a business and it's like, okay, let's get rid of the insiders, let's bring in our own team, let's try to put our own configuration on this, let's downsize just like the orchestra, let's change things, let's make some big bets, let's bet the farm of the business. That piece I thought was so important to share because again, people are taught that this is what you do when you go into those roles. I'd love you to share that fallacy versus actually what you should be doing when you go into a company as a new CEO or a new chief, as you say, not a CEO, a new chief.
Yeah. Well, 100 days and fire and brimstone and all this kind of stuff. The only chief executive I remember talking sense was Gerstner at IBM, who I think after 2 years in office said, "You're not going to get this vision thing out of me." In other words, I'm not ready. He didn't use the word, but he was saying, in effect, I'm still learning, and or we're still learning, and you just you come in and you've got to show how wonderful and great and dramatic you are, and it's just an invitation for failure. You know, you need to do it carefully and thoughtfully. So sometimes a company is so in such dire straits that you have to do dramatic things, of course. But firing 5,000 people every time you don't meet your numbers in a quarterly report, is just, what about all the people who are left? What do they feel?
I was thinking about this and I read a brilliant book called From Barbarians to Bureaucrats. Lawrence Miller is the guy, and he talked about the life cycle of a business and how you need different types of chief at different times of that business. And I thought that was very much reflective of what you were talking about, that context absolutely matters in a business because it depends on the timing, depends on the life cycle, depends on the product's life cycle, all these things.
Yeah, you may need a hard-nosed, very aggressive chief executive as an entrepreneur to get the place started because you got nothing. It's a green field. You start with an idea of some product that you want to make or some niche in the market or whatever, but you have nothing. You don't have facilities, you don't have people, you have nothing else. So you got to build from scratch. And that takes a very strong-willed individual, so strong-willed that it's hard eventually to get rid of that person if you need to do so. Because, everybody in the place is beholden to them. It's all been set up around that person and so on and so forth. So you need very different leadership in an established organization, leadership management in an established organization than in a startup organization. And of course, turnaround brings you back to the kind of startup position because, again, you need someone very strong-willed to get rid of the rot so that you can rebuild around what's strength. But you can't just rebuild in general. You have to build from what's left of the culture. It's like a part in the body that's disintegrating, and you have to find a piece of that part to grow it back in the body. And that's what turnaround people have to do. The culture, I found interestingly enough that in some companies, the culture is still there. The original healthy culture is still there, but buried away. It's been so downtrodden. It's buried away, and people have to find it and regrow it.
Beautiful analogy. Cutting away. I was thinking of like a zombie, and you've the bit in the arm. You have to cut off a bit of the arm so the good meat is left is left before it becomes zombified. But I was thinking about emergent versus deliberate. If you take that more that CEO at the start, that chief at the start, that starts the entrepreneurial spirit, and that's really emergent, and then they get to a point where there's recurring reliable revenue and the strategy seems then deliberate. You bring in new types of people, the administrators, the bureaucrats, and it's in that little element that people think that, well, that's the strategy that works. I'd love your thoughts on that, because that seems to be a huge challenge for people with established legacy organizations.
You come into an organization, everything's sacred, often in an entrepreneurial organization. We can't mess with this, we can't mess with that. It's part of the reason why new technologies are rarely adopted by established companies, because you create it with the technology that's new, but after a while, another technology comes along, and that's why BlackBerry didn't catch up. And it just one after another. It was Nokia, and then it was BlackBerry, and who knows what will happen to Apple in the future, and so on and so forth. They all have their days. And Kodak was the classic example, and Henry Ford, even more classic. You can have it in any color as long as it's black, and everything becomes sacred. And sometimes you need to force out the person who created the place, but that's a very tricky change. And so many of those chief executives have to go back in because their successors can't match what they did. So in Dell and in Starbucks and in all kinds of companies, the founder came back, but that wasn't necessarily the solution. Very hard to follow somebody like Steve Jobs. I mean, Apple is still playing off what Jobs left. I don't see great new innovations coming from Apple these days. Nothing like what Jobs did time after time after time.
I keep expecting something to come out like an Apple, and a literally Apple TV, or an Apple car, an autonomous vehicle, or something that just come out of the R&D labs. Maybe someday. But it's also difficult for the successor, for the person who takes over, because they're always going to be in that shadow. What advice would you have for many CEOs listening to the show, Henry, for those who have taken over from a family business, God forbid it, but how difficult it is for an outsider to come in and fill the shoes of a founder of a family business?
Find a Steve Jobs who will leave you with enough of a legacy so you can get through it before you have to retire. That would be a good idea if you can find those. But now that you mentioned family business and small business, the biggest mistake entrepreneurs make is the assumption that their progeny, usually male, has to succeed them. And this is like playing Russian roulette with 5 bullets. The odds of succeeding are quite small, because the thing that made the entrepreneur what he or she is makes the child, especially of the same sex, a woman following a female entrepreneur maybe just as much as a son following a male entrepreneur. Usually they came out of families where they were in charge. Maybe the father was absent or weak, the mother was strong, the eldest son might have been the strongest person in the family, and that breeds an entrepreneurial personality. Well, in his own family, it's the opposite. He's the strong one in his own family. The father is the strong one, not the son. So bring the son in, can't stand up to the father, struggles to make do, and too often fails. So my advice to those sons or children is, and by the way, a female following a male might work because it's kind of diagonal, just like a daughter inheriting the company, just like a son inheriting the mother's company might work. What sons usually do. Look, you're a son. Your father's a great business person. You'll never do better. But you got tons of money and you're expected to be famous. So this is what you do. You either make films or buy a sports team. You either make bad films or you run a sports team into the ground. But at least you'll be famous and all that. And the way sports teams are going, you'll make a lot of money because the price of franchises is going steadily up. So no matter how much you run that sports team into the ground, you financially, you'll be a success. So my please, please, if you're a sports fan, be careful. The manager fires the coach when the team loses. The owner fires the manager when the team loses and the coaches keep losing, but nobody fires the owners.
Absolutely. Manchester United. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I thought about that with your study on MBAs and Danny Miller's study in that you come into the business, you're focused purely on the team, the senior team. So just my starting 11, say, in soccer, starting 15 in rugby. I don't know what hockey is. I don't know how many in hockey. You're starting 5 in basketball. It's 5, right? So in soccer, you pick your 11, you focus on that 11, you buy in a few superstars, whatever, and you stop focusing on the academy. You win the cup, you win the league, and then you leave on your high horse. Great, you've won it, you got a huge bonus. But the new manager comes in, she takes over, he takes over, the team goes into the ground because you haven't invested in that future. And you mentioned that so many CEOs, chiefs take over organizations. This first thing they do is shut down any R&D or budding future projects. And that, for the soul of this show, Henry, that is something that we see time and time again. We're going through a cycle of that right now.
Yeah, short term. It's easy to cut maintenance, easy to come R&D, and it's also easy to do it with nobody really quite noticing. So what you're doing is screwing the company in the long run, but you look fine in the short run because, after all, look, the costs are down. Wow, you reduce costs and maintain sales until it comes home to roost, and then you realize what you've done. The most famous chief executive in recent times in the US is maybe Jack Welch in GE. Jack Welch was fine at squeezing and figuring out ways of making the existing businesses stronger, but I don't think he introduced any new businesses, and GE remained the last of the real conglomerates, at least in the US, and eventually had to consolidate.
Have you any examples, Henry, of somebody coming in and doing something so radically departed from the core capabilities of the organization, a huge bet that was just so ridiculous that they took the company in a totally different direction and they ultimately failed because they had no capability to execute that strategy?
Well, I could let you answer that question by opening Fortune magazine or Management Today or whatever, reading a couple of stories in the latest issue. But a lot of it are those Harvard 19 people who went into existing companies and, fire and brimstone, and ended up destroying those companies.
I was thinking when I do a show, I write an article and I had this idea of a blog called Bet the Farm. And I found a couple of stuff like Iridium, but I was trying to find like stupid stuff, like absolutely ridiculous bets.
I once consulted a bit with a company called Thorn EMI in the UK, and somebody said something very interesting. They said, ever since Thorn died, nobody knows how to run this place. Now, the way to run a conglomerate is to institute financial controls, but we know eventually that just doesn't work. You can't run a company with the financials imposed on every division. And so it occurred to me, what would make a Thorn able to run that company or anybody else who built up a conglomerate? And it seems to me there's no secret except to do two things: pick good businesses and pick good people to run them and leave them alone.
Speaking of Thorns, I'm trying to link back to the Bedtime Stories. I just want to remind people, I know so many people have stacks and stacks of books on their bedside locker that they intend to read. They have no time to read. This book is brilliant because each of them is a separate blog and you will have time to read it. You'll have time to read it. And as Henry says, let it marinate as you sleep that night. That's why it's a bedtime story for managers. One of them I love, linking the idea of the thorn, is you say...
Let me just say a word about that. The time you need to read it is about 2 minutes for any night, because the stories are all brief. You can read them in a minute or 2 or 3. What I've been trying to do so far without success is get some hotel chain to put them on the bedstands and sell them the way they sell chocolates or wine. Just leave it there and say, if you're coming in from a hard day's work, you're exhausted, you throw yourself into bed, and then suddenly you see this next to you and you, oh my God. So you open it up and you read about scrambled eggs and you buy the book. So if anybody's listening who's running a hotel, please put it on your bedstand.
Because of the measurement problem, they've done away with the Bibles now in hotels as well. So everything's measured.
Yeah. People are tired of the Bible.
I was going to link the idea of the thorn to the strategy is like weeds in a garden. And you share here two approaches, the hothouse model of strategy versus the grassroots model. Again, a core message you get across in this book.
Yeah, what's a weed, Aidan? A weed is a plant you don't want. The most famous weed in North America is the dandelion. But in Europe, you make salads out of dandelion. They make wine. They make liquor out of dandelion. So a weed isn't a good or bad plant. It's a plant you don't want there. I once cut down a maple tree because it was growing in the hedge. Now that's worse than George Washington. The maple leaf is our national symbol in Canada, right? And I just blithely cut the tree down. It was a weed. The maple tree was a weed because it didn't belong in the hedge. And so, it's a good metaphor because weeds can be constructive and weeds can be useful once you realize how they can help. So you can grow strategies the way you grow weeds in a garden. If you see one that's looking like it can bear fruit or be constructive, encourage it. Build a hothouse around it instead of building a hothouse with the things you already know.
I grew up, Henry, in the countryside in Ireland, and we had a nursery, so we grew plants and had a garden center. And my mother is a herbalist, so she'd spot stuff, what appeared to be weeds, but they were medicines, so she'd always gather them and create tinctures and stuff like that. And she's still doing that today. And I always think that's a great tragedy that we lose that knowledge today in the age of the internet. And again, another bedtime story is to talk about the challenge of being a manager in the age of the internet, that before you had time to chat to people, to have those water cooler moments. And when you wrote this, it was before we have this work from home culture, which work from home is absolutely disastrous for innovation. You don't have those moments where you're chatting in the hall, you're mixing people together. And as you say, many managers now are on their email, managing by email, and it's impossible to get to that soul back in the business that we talked about.
Yeah. I'm just doing an article called Is Serendipity Serendipitous? And it's not, in the sense that, we hang out at the water cooler because we expect something good to happen. We go to conferences because every time we get in an elevator, there might be an opportunity to do something, new customer, new colleague, whatever it is, new hire. And so we should expect serendipity, and effective people and effective companies play on serendipity. They use it instead of treating it as, oh my God, what a stroke of luck. Strokes of luck happen all the time to the people who are prepared to make use of them.
When you're so focused on measurement, like you talk about this several times in this book, is that I'm so focused on measurement. I have to measure everything in hospitals. Every little metric is tracked by some consultancy firm that says we should do that. And as a result, I miss the really important stuff. I miss serendipity because of this over focus. I thought that is an important thing to share.
Yeah, researchers talk about outliers, but it's the outliers that matter. I say when you're doing research and when you're managing, cherish the anomalies. Cherish the anomalies because you never know what's going to turn out to be extremely useful. And it's the exceptions that can be grown into major strategies.
I mentioned in the intro the organizing like a cow. We mentioned scrambled eggs. I wanted to make sure I deliver on everything that I mentioned there. There's loads more, so many more great stories in the book that will have you thinking and having positive dreams instead of the nightmares that many managers have. But there's a diagram you share in the book, which is organizing like a cow. And I thought we'd share this as a really important aspect in the book.
Yeah, this was an ad for a high-tech company that said, this is not a cow, just like the famous painting, This Is Not a Pipe, because it's a painting of a pipe, and this is not a cow. This is a chart of a cow, and it shows the parts of a cow, but a real cow has no trouble integrating the parts. But if you mix up a chart with a cow, you're in trouble. And a real organization, you could put, instead of chuck and ribs and short loin, you could put marketing and finance and accounting. But in a real organization, these things don't sit as separate entities. They blend and work and combine. And you have to ask yourself whether you want your organization to work like a chart or like a cow.
I'm just going to link it to another thing, which is you're talking about how the Europeans carved up the Europe and Asia and Russia, and how that actually reflects the whole idea of the map is not the territory. But this happens in organizations all the time, that things are carved up, again, without knowing the true essence of the businesses.
I love this idea of continents, that there's Europe and there's Asia. Now, if I look at a globe, I can distinguish North America, I can distinguish South America, I can distinguish Africa, I can distinguish Antarctica. But the only reason Europe is a continent is because the Europeans decided to make the continent. So they drew an arbitrary line around the Ural Mountains or something like that, and they said, this is Europe and that's Asia. But it's not, it's Eurasia. And it could be, and I actually use this example. We start with the Irish, okay? Now, please don't feel insulted, but the British are not so different from the Irish, okay? Who are not so different from the French, who are not so different from the Germans, who are not so different from the Persians, who are not so different from the Indians, who are not so different from the Mongolians, who are not so different from the Japanese. And we've made our way from Ireland to Japan, and we don't know where to draw. I mean, there's nowhere to draw the line. Although the Irish are rather different from the Japanese, in fact. But where do we draw the line? So the Europeans drew a line, and they drew a completely artificial line. I comment that any continent that contains both India and Japan can't be serious, because those two countries are as antithetical as any two countries I can imagine.
You've been to Ireland, Henry. The difference between counties in Ireland is dramatically. It's like Japan and Ireland within Ireland as well. But I agree with you. I always think about this, that all dogs emanated from wolves. Wolves were the original dogs, and then they all became all these. And no dog ever meets each other and kind of goes, "Oh, you're a Chihuahua. Oh, you're different from me." They're all like just sniff each other, you know. And I was like going, that's one of the big problems. And we have this out of Africa hypothesis that we all came from the same spawn at some stage, but we treat each other like we're so different, and we add in political aspects, etc., etc. There's so much more I wanted to share in the book. Brilliant, brilliant stories. Highly, highly recommend. It's a short book. As Henry said, 2 minutes per chapter maximum. Some are even less than that. If you own a hotel chain, get in touch with Henry. Get in touch with me, and I'll connect you with Henry as well. Put this book in all the dressers throughout the hotel. The last thing I thought I'd mention, because I mentioned it in the intro, is the board as a bee, and the importance of the board not using its sting too often.
You know, bees only get to sting once. But the threat of being stung is significant, and that you could say that about boards. Boards can't keep firing chief executives. Then you start wondering about the board. So they can fire once, and then they better be careful about their next choice. But boards don't run companies, obviously, or when boards try and run NGOs, non-government organizations, they make a bloody mess of it. So because they come from business maybe and know better, they think. But they need to be bees like other boards. They need to choose people to run those organizations and not meddle.
The thing I loved about the book, and my huge lesson from all your work, is that strategy is not deliberate. It's not about doing, it's about learning, and having the humility to realize that you're not going to get it right. If you're a board member, if you're an investor, if you're a stakeholder or stockholder in a company, to realize that how can somebody get it right in a world of so much change? And last thing I wanted to tee up for you to say is, it hasn't really changed. We feel that we have so much change upon us the whole time, but it's always been change. It's always been in flux. We just think that this is more busy than ever time before. It's not the case. It's always been like this.
Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. More things change, the more they stay the same. Although I'm not sure now. But, I've been hearing we live in times of great change since at least the 40s. I wasn't hearing in the 40s, but I was reading in the 50s and 60s and 70s. I even read two intelligent professors from the University of Michigan who said in a book that we live, yet again, we live in times of great change. You know, there may have been very changeful times, and they say like the Depression and the war, but nothing like now. The 60s compared to the Depression and the war. I mean, we aggrandize ourselves by thinking we live in times of great change, but unfortunately, maybe right now we are living in times of great change. Unfortunately, maybe significantly because we think we live in times of great change, and we've been making all kinds of changes that have been ill-advised.
Absolutely, and I highly, highly recommend Henry's work. I have a feeling we'll be connected to get again in the future, Henry. I'm going to keep pestering you to come back on the show again, because there's another 18 books to cover as well, or 19 actually, because of the 21st book as well. This book's an absolute cracker. Bedtime Stories for Managers. Absolute cracker. I'll link to it in the notes as well. If you are a hotel chain and you're interested in stocking the book, get in touch. As I said, the author of that book, Henry Mintzberg, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. It's always a delight.